Now, as someone who has a lack of interest in the subject of history, whether that would be large massacres or world wars, all of the violence, gore, and toxic politics seem to blend together into one large mess. It all seems to be saturated in people who are begging for change, corrupt figures, and barely any changes brought out of it. However, one event in particular stands out from the rest for being discussed for its strange theories, all the way to being made fun of for not happening. That event being the Tiananmen Square Massacre. Now, what differentiates it from other events? Well, not much, but what seems to be amazing is how the country, more specifically its government, still treats it as an event that was supposed to happen in order for the country to progress to greater heights. When, by this day and age, God knows they should have learned from the event by now. Now, the Tiananmen Square Massacre is regarded by people to be one of the most brutal and infamous genocides in all history. This is particularly due to the controversy the event had sparked up during its time, and the controversy still being held over it to this day, along with its impact. It remains to this day one of the most discussed events in history over its controversy, and is brought up in various forms of media you would not expect to see. So, what ultimately caused the untimely occurrence of the Tiananmen Square Massacre? Alright, so during the 1980s, the popular reformist leader known as Hu Yangbang had been an important figure regarding his promotions of economic and political reform, as he was also a high-ranking Communist Party official. Unfortunately enough, despite his reputation, he was treated as an outcast by his conservative opponents, and was so up until his untimely death on the 15th of April, 1989. Subsequently following his death, on the 17th of April, 1989, hundreds of students marched towards the Tiananmen Square and protested at the monument towards the people's revolutionary heroes. They protested against corruption, for a greater demand in freedom of speech, and economic freedom. However, unfortunately enough, to this day, nothing seems to have changed or panned out from it. Now, these demands did not sit well with the conservatives of the Communist Party, and so the government made its move by bringing out their defense. These demonstrations spread throughout hundreds of cities across the country. Female students were killed with bayonets as they were pleading for mercy on their lives. Though there was a set of people who viewed the students as patriotic, there was another set of people divided into thinking they were a threat to the regime. The massacre got so heartbreakingly violent, a mother was even shot as she was trying to make an effort to aid her daughter of 3 years. As people were in a large demand for responses from government officials and authorities, Sir Alan Donald, the British ambassador to Beijing at the time, wrote, "Army ambulances who attempted to give aid were shot up, as was a Sino-Japanese hospital ambulance, with medical crew dead. Wounded driver attempted to ram attackers but was blown to pieces by anti-tank weapon." Now, this statement alone clearly described the violent nature of the event occurring, and it was only supported by more claims from victims, relatives of victims, and the cable even stated that the troops even shot the officers. As the government made an attempt to justify their actions of violation, they stated that for many days, the People's Liberation Army has exercised restraint and now must resolutely counteract the rebellion. All those who refuse to listen to reason must take full responsibility for their actions and their consequences. Alright, so to this day, Chinese officials view these protests as incredibly taboo and sensitive. The movement remains ousted from their official history, and it is censored from the Chinese internet and school textbooks. Those who make an attempt to commemorate the event are punished, with intellectuals, writers, and activists placed under home arrest. Victims' relatives are barred from mourning their loved ones publicly. The Communist Party, to this day and age, rejects calls for political liberalization and has more control over people's speech in order to maintain more stability. The government justifies its military crackdown as a vital action in order to bring stability to the political world, for the economy to prosper and its eventual rise. And if your country is run by anyone other than him, then your country should not be making excuses for the occurrence of violence. Alright, so the Tiananmen Square massacre remains to this day one of the most infamous and violent genocides known to man, and still has an effect on the people whose relatives were murdered in the massacre, who were traumatized by the utter cruelty of the event, and remains as a point in time where people were in a grave state because of their own government. And that seems to be a growing trend in this day and age. Now, comparing it side by side to another infamous genocide, though not as spoken of in the same light, such as the Rwandan genocide, there are similarities to each of them in that they are both hate crimes. The events resulted in large trauma all over the nation and resulted in major international reactions, as countries from all over the world expressed their sorrow and mourn over the situation that had happened. The people of China were in deep grieving and fear of the country's state, just like Rwanda at the time of its genocide. Now, despite the fact that there are various similarities that can be picked out regarding the Tiananmen Square massacre and the Rwandan genocide, it differs from the Rwandan genocide just by the fact that the Chinese government has not been willing to recognize the event as something that did more harm than good, something that Rwanda has been able to acknowledge with its genocide, and something Germany has been able to recognize with the Holocaust. Along with their motifs, the Rwandan genocide was more of an issue of racism, whilst the Tiananmen Square massacre was more of an attempt by the government to silence those trying to bring out their voices against the authorities, which led the government to bring out their defenses, if you will. Now, regarding the definition of a genocide, the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it as the deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group. And by this definition, this event, the Tiananmen Square massacre, is without a shred of a doubt a genocide. This is due to the fact that through this event, a political group's greater demand and freedom of speech and economic freedoms for the people were violated by the government. And in some occasions, it still happens to this day, more often than not. And so, in conclusion, the Tiananmen Square massacre serves as a lesson in history that though the authorities claim their acts as a defense, relatives of the victims still feel the injustice that was brought upon to their loved ones on that fateful day. These demonstrations spread throughout hundreds of cities across the country, as its death tally reached to a staggering amount of 10,000 people, setting its mark in history as an infamous event in the 20th century. The impact of the genocide remains to this day one of the most impactful in the 20th to 21st century, and serves as a checkpoint in seeing that the Chinese government is simply unable to admit their wrongdoings to the people they are serving,
as a mark of their corruption, just like a few people I know.
Thanks for watching, and remember,
please, for the sake of the people, have accountability.